Welcome back to another episode of Health Law Pulse. I'm your host, John Rhodes, healthcare attorney and founder of Health Law Counsel, LLC. Today's episode focuses on a topic that sits at the center of many healthcare transactions, regulatory investigations, and compliance discussions, but often doesn't get much attention outside those legal and finance circles, and that's fair market value. In healthcare, compensation structures, physician arrangements, and transactions don't just have business implications. They carry significant regulatory risk under laws like Stark and the anti-kickback statute. And in many cases, the difference between a defensible arrangement and a problematic one comes down to how organizations think about value, incentives, and structure. My guest today is Chris David, managing partner of HealthValue Group and a valuation expert who has spent years evaluating healthcare transactions, compensation models, and complex financial arrangements across the industry. In this episode, we discuss where organizations most often get into trouble when structuring deals, how valuation and legal teams can work together more effectively, and how private equity, consolidation, and increased scrutiny are changing the healthcare transaction landscape. We also talk about a bigger question that's becoming increasingly important: how healthcare organizations can balance financial strategy with regulatory and operational realities in a rapidly evolving industry. This is Health Law Pulse. Chris David, thank you for joining us on this episode of Health Law Pulse. Appreciate you carving out some time. I know that you're on a very busy schedule. You are at a conference, right, an HLA conference right now, joining us from a hotel room. So appreciate, and for those that are looking at this or listening to this on my YouTube channel, we have our cameras off just because we've had some technical issues. So I don't think anyone wants to look at us anyways, Chris. So I think that's totally fine.
That's about right.
Yeah, I appreciate you carving out some time. I know you're on the road. Thanks for accommodating and joining us on this episode. Before we dive in, just would appreciate you giving us a little bit about your background, what you do within the healthcare space, and your organization.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to join you and talk about healthcare compliance. So, Jonathan, I'm what a lot of people would call, I'm a recovering accountant. That means I was a CPA in a former life. I served a 3-year sentence in the Ernst& Young Audit Department of Corrections. I knew I didn't want to be an auditor my whole life, so I migrated over to the valuation and due diligence side of the accounting and consulting firm. For 25 years, I've been in valuation for that long. And I started this firm 16 years ago. And HealthValue Group is a national healthcare fair market advisory and transaction consulting firm. So 90% of what we do is fair market value compliance, fair market value opinions, and consulting to comply with the Stark and anti-kickback laws, and also the IRS private enrollment laws. So we play in that space, and we talk Stark and AKS every day.
Yeah.
And so we do valuations of services, everything from nebulous administrative and marketing services, MSO, to clinical, physician clinical services, on-call, medical directorship, supervisory. And so we also do valuation of companies, actual equities of companies, and we do valuations for fixed assets and intangible assets. So pretty much if there's any type of transaction or arrangement in the healthcare space where you have a organization that participates in the Medicare, Medicaid program where their compliance attorneys, they need an F&B opinion, that's where we come in. So that's the space that we play in, Jonathan.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thanks for providing that context. And I've been really looking forward to this discussion. We haven't tackled fair market value yet on this podcast. So, and clearly we've got the expert here. And Chris, I've been accused a lot of on this podcast of using acronyms and using things that while I think a lot of those that listen to this podcast understand, not all of them do. So before we dive into this topic, you did a great job explaining this. I think it's helpful to take a step back and explain why fair market value matters so much in the healthcare space, especially for those that aren't living in this
Sure.
every day. So, in most industries, as you know, as a recovering accountant, valuation is primarily about economics, what something is worth in the market. In healthcare, as you mentioned, Chris, is very different because valuation is tied directly to regulatory compliance. You mentioned a couple important ones where certain requirements, both on the compensation side as well as on the transaction side, require that the transaction is fair market value. You mentioned the Stark Law, which is the physician self-referral law, and then the federal anti-kickback statute related to items or services reimbursable by a federal healthcare program. So payments between healthcare providers, whether that's compensation arrangements, joint ventures, acquisitions, are heavily regulated to prevent financial relationships from influencing patient care decisions. And that's really what it's all about is ensuring that the dollars aren't influencing or inducing the referral patterns of patients. So that's where fair market value comes in. It's meant to ensure that payments reflect the legitimate business value, not incentives that are tied to referrals or volume of services. And when those lines get blurred, that's when legal regulatory risk starts to emerge. So while fair market value may sound like a technical financial concept, it's actually a central safeguard in how healthcare is structured and regulated in the United States. Is that a fair assessment, Chris, in terms of what fair market
Yes,
value,
John.
why it's important in the healthcare space?
Yes, Jonathan. I think you did an excellent job of describing that. That's exactly right. The only other term I would use is that it prevents
Right.
overutilization of Medicare dollars
Yep.
or overutilization of healthcare when it's not necessary. And I also call it just the prevent the appearance of a kickback.
Yep.
Is that our deals have to be blessed with a fair market value opinion so that you don't have the appearance of a kickback where one group is going to pay a physician a little extra so that physician can keep referring patients to their hospital.
Yep.
So but I think you did a great job of explaining it.
Yeah, and that's a great ad. I appreciate it, Chris. And so fair market value is really important. So whenever there's a transaction or like a major compensation arrangement, this is when a health system or any major healthcare provider will go obtain the services of Chris and his group or any independent valuation organization that does work in this space to obtain that independent valuation to really ascertain what fair market value is. So, and Chris, you've spent your career valuing healthcare transactions across a wide range of settings. And let's just start off with this. How do you approach fair market value in highly regulated healthcare arrangements where the valuation, it's not about economics, it's not just about economics, but it's also about regulatory defensibility. Just kind of walk us through briefly from a high level, how do you approach FMV in that situation?
Well, the way we approach fair market value is, I would say, primarily through what we call market transaction data. We look at comparable compensation data from third party surveys conducted by groups like MGMA, Medical Management Group Associates, and then
Right.
there's AMGA, American Medical Group Associations. They conduct annual surveys of physician compensation along with Sullivan Cotter. That's what we call market data. And then when we're talking about the valuation of businesses, medical practices, hospitals, labs, surgery centers. Then we look at what's called transaction data. What have other similar types of businesses sold for? And we look at different types of transaction multiples. So the premise behind that is if if there's other market data that supports or that points to a certain valuation, then we have a market compensation. We have a market indication. What is the market telling us? What's going on in the market? What numbers are reflective of the market? So first and foremost, we would look to what's called a market approach. And then when we're talking about mainly the value of businesses, we look at what's called the income approach. And it's commonly referred to as the discounted cash flow methodology. We look at the economics of the cash flow. look at the cash flows, and we discount those numbers back to the present value to come up with a fair and defensible valuation. So those are the two primary methods: market multiples and then also income, the economic stream.
Perfect. Yeah, that's interesting, Chris. I'm interested in your thoughts on this because one thing, and I think this will be particularly interesting for our compliance and legal friends that are listening. One thing I've seen, and please feel free to push back on this if you see it differently,
Mhm.
is that fair market value opinions are often treated as sort of this safe harbor. In reality, they're just one piece of a much bigger regulatory picture. But from your perspective, and feel free to push back on that, but from your perspective, where do organizations most often get into trouble when structuring compensation arrangements or transactions?
Well, I would say they would get into most trouble when they don't get a third party fair market value opinion,
Uh-huh.
and they're actually overpaying. If we're talking about physician compensation, let's first start there. That's what I would say is that they're overpaying a physician. I would hope, Jonathan, I would hope that your in-house counsel or outside counsel would know better than to structure a compensation that's based on the volume or value of referrals. I mean, that's just
Right.
our basics. That's our blocking and tackling. I can't imagine that anybody that's involved in healthcare compliance would put together any type of arrangement or an employment agreement that ties a physician's compensation based on the referral path. I can't imagine that would ever happen. So I want to say that they just overpay a physician. Maybe they're overpaying a physician. Their compensation is not commensurate with their level of productivity. And we might be putting the cart before the horse right now if I talk about physician productivity compared to physician compensation. Let's say if a physician is only producing at the median level, but they're paying that physician at the 90th percentile, there's a problem. The optics of that are not good. So to sum it up, I would say the biggest area of healthcare organizations getting into trouble is not aligning a physician's compensation with their productivity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. I agree. I've seen that one before. Two more that immediately come to mind, Chris, and push back if you think this isn't as big of an issue. But two things that I've seen are one, relying on a fair market. They do take that step that you're recommending and get that fair market value opinion or get the data that's needed, in the compensation space especially. But then they rely on that for a very long time, right? So not getting updated information because and think of
Yes.
that. So how often does that, there's survey data probably every year, and how important is it to, from a valuator's perspective, to, because you see how the data changes from year to year, how important is it to get that opinion updated?
I don't think it's so important to get the valuation updated every year as it is to look at the employment arrangement and check to see, is that physician producing at the level that's commensurate with their compensation. When they first put the contract together, it was such that, hey, this position needs to produce, let's say, 5,000 work RVUs to get paid this comp. Well, if you look at it 2 years later, and
Uh,
that position is only producing 3,000 work RVUs, then you have a problem. I think that's more important than getting the updated FMV because, yes, the compensation does change each year, but I believe it's more important to see, is the position producing at a commensurate level for that comp? At least
yep,
look at the contract and look at the physician's productivity because most firms like ours, when we issue a fair market value opinion, it's based on an assumed level of productivity.
yep,
So I think that's more important. And
yep,
then let me back up for a moment, Jonathan. And you asked me a minute ago about where do, I guess, these healthcare providers or organizations get into trouble. I've been reading these DOJ enforcement actions and news of investigations or indictments, and I think it's mostly bad actors. It's
yeah,
it's organizations that are blatantly breaking the law, and are paying for referrals. I think that's most of what's going on.
Yeah.
That's where you see a lot of the enforcement patterns is that just plain out bad actors.
Yep. No, that makes perfect sense. And Chris, I appreciate what you said in terms of making it, and I totally agree with this because I've been involved in a number of deals, both on the transactional side as well as the compensation side, where the assumptions have changed, right? And the compensation is more,
Yes.
but to your point, a year later, 12, 24 months, and sometimes it should be, and I always recommend this to bake that regular cadence of review into the employment agreement or into the professional services arrangement, whatever the case may be, because
Hmm.
those assumptions could very well change. What you think the volume will be or what you think the productivity will be may very well not be the case 12 months later. And so I think that's important. And that could really impact what we think about in terms of fair market value. So that's a great point. The other one, Chris, I'm not smart enough to think of a great example off the top of my head, but when organizations take a fair market value opinion they've obtained and try to sort of fit this square peg into a round hole and sort of try to apply it across other sort of situations, similar but not exactly the same, where the assumptions are clearly different and sort of just fit that in because you're working on when you write your valuation opinion, you're working on a number of set assumptions, a number of set facts that if you just try to apply that across the board to different scenarios, very well may impact the result, and you won't necessarily get the same outcome in the opinion. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. That's exactly right. Every appraiser looks at a service arrangement or even a business valuation based on the specific fact patterns.
Right.
And so that you have to use those assumptions and fact patterns and particular facts and circumstances to value that arrangement. So trying to fit that into another arrangement, it's not a good idea. No, you have to look at the exact um, facts and circumstances of every arrangement and value it based on that. And it's mostly based on an assumed level of productivity.
Yep.
Now, things get a little hairier and things get a little different when you have a rural clinic or a rural medical center where you know that the collections are not going to exceed what you're paying that specialist, but you need that specialist in that rural community. Let's say you're going to pay them 500,000, but yet you know the collections for that are probably going to be 300,000, and the numbers don't make sense. But there's reasons for that comp to be so high because it's difficult to recruit someone to that rural area, but yet you need that specialist. And otherwise, if they try to staff that specialist by using locums, they just pay an exorbitant amount.
Right.
I don't mean to digress there, but that's just a situation where okay, that's a really unique situation. You're right. It's not a good idea to try to take one opinion and apply to other compensation arrangements. And also, I'll also mention this. Another thing that I see people do is they resist getting a fair market value opinion because let's face it, it's kind of like an insurance policy.
Yep.
And some people view it, okay, we'll just roll the dice. We'll just roll the dice and we don't need to pay for an FMV. It's not that high risk. And some people will take that risk.
Yeah. I mean, particularly in the startup space, Chris, that's where I see more risk tolerance because you got a startup group or healthcare company that's from a legal perspective, you may recommend a fair market value opinion because you're providing, okay, these are the overarching rules, right? One of which is the arrangement needs to be fair market value. Here's the best way to determine that. But they don't always want to do that just because of cost, I think, mostly. And I,
Hmm.
I I agree with you. I see that risk tolerance even greater really within the startup space as opposed to large established health systems.
Sure. That's exactly right. And that's an area that they could take a risk and not spend a bunch of money on them. You're right. But it's a risk.
Yeah.
It's a risk. When you're a startup, that's what you're doing. You're evaluating risk and budgeting your money.
Yeah. I think that's fair. I think that's right. And it kind of leads me. to start thinking about the more nuanced issues in this space. I'm curious if you, this is more of sort of a legal opinion, but I'm curious to see if you have any thoughts on this. There are situations that I've come across, Chris, where an arrangement may technically meet fair market value, but maybe it still doesn't feel entirely comfortable from a regulatory standpoint. How do you think about arrangements that maybe fit within, whether on the high range of fair market value, regardless it's within range, still raise regulatory concerns, or that's just kind of generally under overall scrutiny? Any thoughts? Have you come across that? Is that something
Um,
that
well,
that that you concern yourself with as a valuator?
yes, Jonathan. To me, what you're describing, and I might be digressing or going off track for a moment, but what I think you're describing is commercial reasonableness.
Right.
Now, if you don't want me to go there, just go ahead and say it. Let's just don't go there. But I think that the concept of commercial reasonableness is ignored. It's not given enough attention. So I'm just going to throw that in there, but I'll come back to the fair market value. Other than that, Jonathan, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understand your question.
Think that's right, Chris. So I didn't do a
Ask the
good
question
job
again.
articulating it, but I think so. Just for people out there, for depending on the arrangement, there are two components to it: fair market value, and to what you said, Chris, commercial reasonableness. So something an arrangement could fit fair market value, but from a like an arm's length transaction perspective, it may not make a lot of business sense. And so that's where the commercial reasonableness comes in. And so what role do you play
Yeah.
as evaluator in that component? That's exactly right.
Sure. Okay, and we don't have to go off on that tangent, Jonathan, but from a layman's terms, commercial reasonableness is, does the arrangement make sense?
Hmm.
In the absence of referrals, does it make sense that we need let's say, do we need a medical director for pediatrics when you're in a retirement community in Florida?
Yep.
Like, do you really need two medical directors, or does it make commercial sense? Do you really need that? So that might be a weak example, but commercial reasonableness is such a nebulous concept because you have the word reasonableness. What I consider reasonable might be different than what you consider reasonable, but that's where it turns out to be. That's where it's an opinion. It's opinion, and how do you support your opinion of what is considered reasonable or what's considered unreasonable? So that's all I'll really say about that. I don't want to digress too much because we're supposed to talk about fair market value, but sometimes it's tough to discuss fair market value without just mentioning CR, commercial
Yeah.
reasonableness. So we can go back to FMV.
Yeah, I think that's fair, Chris. The only reason I bring it up is I do think that fair market value does receive a lot of attention, and rightfully so. That other piece is very important as well, making sure that the arrangement is commercially reasonable, does make sense from a arm's length transaction perspective. I think sometimes that gets ignored. So, yeah, I appreciate your thoughts on that. I want to shift gears a little bit, Chris, and talk a little bit about ways of working. And this is largely for my compliance and legal friends out there. How should, in your experience, legal and compliance and valuation teams such as yours work together more effectively to navigate these issues, whether it's compensation arrangement, transaction arrangement? At what point
Okay, yeah, that's a good
transaction?
question.
Yeah, well, at what point do you think your team and a legal or compliance team should really be working together?
Well, first of all, the legal and compliance team should know when and where a transaction or an arrangement needs to meet fair market value, and do you really need an F&V opinion? I would say that if you have, this is sort of the rule of thumb, anything below the 75th percentile compensation is low risk. That's what a lot of, let's call it, I guess, value compensation or compliance professionals believe, is that if you're paying a doctor something around the median or the 75th, it's low risk. It's not good. Let's don't mess with it. Let's not get an FOD. But if you have a scenario where you're paying someone over the 75th percentile, then yes, we need a third party fair market value opinion. Now, how do the in-house compliance folks work well with their evaluators? Is number one, provide them with all of the necessary and pertinent information. any historical information, let's say the historical collections or work RVUs of that particular position or the physician that used to work in that role, anything else that is pertinent and relevant to the position that we're looking at, or even the transaction if they're buying another medical practice, if they're buying into a surgery center, the evaluator will let you know all the information that they need. And I think it's important that the organization provides the appraiser with all the pertinent information.
That's excellent insight, Chris. I'm going to add one thing, and that's just from a legal perspective. One thing I preach to a lot of my clients um, that are in a situation where they're frequently needing to get fair market value data or opinions, depending on what the transact or the arrangement is governance in this space is so important. Having policies and procedures and governance in terms of, let's just use compensation as an example, and I'm using this totally as a hypothetical example. If you're offering a physician or a specialist, whatever the case may be, at the 50th percentile, and that's where we feel comfortable as a healthcare organization, we're not going to even blink if we're at the median, right, at the 50th percentile. Between the 50th and 75th. Now, 75th requires some additional justification, but you document that justification.
Correct.
And you run it by legal, you run it by compliance, and you document that. And then another level of review, and maybe at this point you get a third party opinion at, at the 90th or 95th, whatever the case may be, but having that governance structure in place, so okay, if it hits this percentile, we're going to do X. If it hits this percentile, we're going to have this additional layer of review and so on. I think that's so important. I don't know if you as evaluator get involved in that, but from a healthcare provider sort of legal compliance perspective, I just think that governance is really critical.
I would totally agree with that, John. The governance is very important. Um, and we don't get involved in that so much.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, I'm a compliance professional. You and I both do the same thing. We help the clients manage risk, right? And having those governance documents in place I mean, it's critical. The penalties can be huge. And so having those guidelines, I think is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, I got another question for you. I have a lot of guests on this podcast, and we talk about data all the time. And I have so many clients, Chris, where data is I mean, it's something we deal with almost on a daily basis, where like, if you engage a third party contractor or whatever the case may be, who can use what data and for what purposes. And this is less an issue on the compensation side, I understand that, but let's just say on the transactional side, has that impacted your methodologies in valuing medical group assets, for example, or health system assets? What part does data or the amount of data or the type of data play into your thoughts and your analysis?
That's a really good question, Jonathan. And so the data should tell the story, or a fair market value opinion should tell a story. And generally, the data should support our opinion. And the data, we should have sufficient relevant data. And whether it be transaction data, if you're looking at the transaction of, let's say, an oncology clinic, are we looking at similar market transactions of similar oncology practices? Or are we looking at compensation data of a pediatric neurologist? And the data has to be comparable. So that's where a good analyst comes in is, are we looking at comparable data? Is there a sufficient amount of data? Here's another example, the sample size. Let's say you're looking at a rare specialty, for a rare medical specialist. The sample size in these surveys for that is going to be really, really small. And so you better have some more methodologies or some more surveys to support compensation. So a lot of times you might see 2,000 survey respondents in a compensation survey for, let's say, hospitalists or cardiologists or family practitioner. But if you have a very rare specialist, the survey data will be really, really small. And that's that's challengeable. You
Right.
can challenge that. And that's not a great representation of the market. So back to your question about data, yes, a good analyst, a good evaluator will focus on data, will have sufficient relevant data, and their report should tell a story. You should tell the story and how you support your opinion. And I'm pretty good at this because I did serve some time as an expert witness, and that's always tough. And
Hmm.
opposing counsel will always ask you a question, and they love to come back to, what's the basis for your opinion, Mr. David? What's the basis for your opinion? And you can't say, well, because I feel like it just seems right. No, that's not good enough.
Right. Yeah.
The moral of the story is have sufficient relevant data to support your opinion.
Yeah. I like that. That's great insight. And lawyers and their questions are the worst, right? I mean, that's just the way it is. That's the way we operate. I
Well,
put
a
this
lot
on
of
the
times
on top of the entire profession.
well, a lot of times they ask good questions.
Yeah, absolutely. That is great insight, Chris. I really appreciate that and your expertise. I like to end. We're going to get you out of this each episode with a quick lightning round. I'm going to ask you three quick questions.
Okay, this will be good.
This, well,
Lightning round.
before we get there, Chris,
Okay.
it may surprise you that this segment is actually sponsored. My lightning rounds are sponsored by a company called Western Associates. They provide corporate merchandise. It's a great organization. Provide high quality branded merchandise and corporate products that people actually want to keep. I'm actually wearing a shirt from Western Associates with my logo on it, but you just got to take my word for it because we're not doing camera today. So
Okay.
it's a fantastic product. If your organization is looking to elevate its brand through custom merchandise, you can learn more at westernassociates.com or contact my good friend Mike Eldridge, Meldridge at westernassociates.com. And we'll also include a link in the episode description if you want to learn more. Okay, Chris, three lightning round questions for you. The first, one red flag in a deal that people overlook.
What type of deal? A compensation or a
Okay,
or
let's go with transaction.
okay. Not having the right transaction data.
Yeah, it's hard to.
Like using transaction data from a different type of medical practice.
Yeah, it's hard to start your work when you're not operating from from the right data. I could totally see that.
Not having comparable data.
Yep, yep. That's great. Second, one thing valuation experts wish lawyers would do earlier in a deal. Lawyers or compliance professionals.
Provide us with all of the relevant information.
Got it. Okay. Noted. I'll start doing that. And number three, book you're reading, podcast you're listening to, or show you're binging right now, Chris.
A show that I'm binging is Friends and Neighbors with John Hamm on Apple TV.
Excellent. Okay, perfect. Chris, this has been really insightful. I appreciate your expertise. Appreciate the discussion today. And that's it for this episode of Health Law Pulse. I want to thank Chris for his great insight, carving out some time on the road from his busy schedule and sharing your insights and expertise with us today. So thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Sure, Jonathan. It was my pleasure.
Excellent.
Have
All
a
right.
good one.
You too. Take care. I want to thank Chris for bringing practical perspective to an area that's often discussed in very technical terms, but has enormous real-world implications for healthcare organizations. A few takeaways that stood out to me. First, fair market value isn't just a finance concept in healthcare, it's a regulatory and operational risk issue. Second, many of the biggest problems in transactions and compensation arrangements don't come from obvious misconduct. They come from misalignment between incentives, operations, and governance. And third, as healthcare continues to consolidate and evolve, organizations are going to face increasing scrutiny around how deals are structured, valued, and operationalized. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Health Law Pulse. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'm going to ask you just to take 30 seconds out of your day to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend. We are on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. You can also find links to these episodes on my website at www.healthlawcounsel.com. We'll be back soon with more conversations at the intersection of healthcare, law, technology, and leadership. Take care.